and welcome to today's discussion on the future of employee listening. I'm Camilla Clark, and I'm joined by an expert panel of people who have deep knowledge and extensive experience in HR transformation, organisational culture, leadership development, employee engagement, and behavioural science nonetheless. We want today's discussion to push the boundary on employee feedback and how we listen to our people. We will try to take the topic outside of its box today and ultimately help leaders to start thinking about how they can not just measure employee engagement, but create it. So, hello panel. Thank you very much for being here. Before we get started with our juicy questions, I just want to go around and say who you are and why do you think we need to do more with employee listening? So perhaps, David, we could start with you.
Sure. So I'm David Fairhurst. I support organisations on HR strategy, and I used to be on the inside of organisations, which is where I pull most of my experience from. And I think to your question of listening, I think strategically, there's never been a more important time to really strategically and intentionally dial up listening. The workplace is changing dramatically, and it's changing in a way that's been different from history, actually. The whole notion of going to work is not that old. In the 1700s, there was the machinery, the Jeffrey Tull, where machinery became a thing, and then we went through the Ford era of making processes and people going in process lines and all of that. We went through the information technology. It wasn't that long ago since the first computer came into the workplace, only 1954, I think, around that time. And then I've always hoped for the next number of years it was going to be about optimizing people in organizations. But we're seeing another wave now, really, with AI and whatever, which is a real opportunity where things will speed up, but maybe some thinking will slow down. And I think with the sort of change that workplaces are going to see now, it really means that listening intentionally has probably never been more important.
Wonderful, thank you. Taliwa, why don't you introduce yourself and answer the same question?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Taliwa Hughes, and I'm the founder of Zora Consultancy. My background is behavioural science and psychology. So for me, we help organisations with all things the behavioural patterns and how that affects change, growth, understanding AI, resisting AI, and all of the changes that's happening within organisations. And I think employee listening is a crucial one today because how we listen has changed. Today's workforce is so different than it ever has been. And there's consistently, we're seeing this with how people show up at work. So definitely that then affects how people listen and actually what curiosity looks like. That was actually really different 5 to 10 years ago. And so my job is always understanding that behavioural side of things. And actually, I'm really looking forward to this conversation, to just talking more about that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being part of it. And Steve, introduce yourself and why do we need to do more with employee listening?
Thank you, Camilla. So Steve Frost. I founded WorkBuzz about 8 years ago. That makes me sound really, really old on that. And so I've been involved in employee listening about a decade. I think two things are really colliding at the moment. Some of the things that Dave and Tula just mentioned in terms of we've got 5 generations in the workforce. The way employees engage with content outside of work is different. It's video, it's voice notes. But was the last time to complete forms or surveys in work? That doesn't really feel engaging. You've got expectations to change, and employees are expecting you to listen to their feedback and act on it rapidly, but we're not doing that at the moment. And the workforce is changing. Sort of, we may even have a new prime minister by the time this sort of podcast finishes. All this change around AI, new roles being created. So the pace of change is getting faster. Employers' expectations are changing and heightening, and the way to engage with content out to the work is different. So we have to react to that. I think at the same time, AI creates new possibilities for ways to listen which wasn't possible before. We're able to crowdsource feedback and turn it into action and insights within hours in a way that hasn't been possible. So I don't think it's been ever as exciting time to be an employee listening, but a huge amount to talk about. So thank you for having me here today.
Thank you. It sounds like we are having the conversation at the right time. So thank you all for being here. Okay, so let's get into it and let's start with leadership, first of all, a topic that comes up time and time again. Today, we want to dive into the blind spots and the risk of leadership not listening fully, properly, clearly, or authentically. First, David, I'm going to come to you. So WorkBuzz's research has shown that 77% of employees want leaders to be more visible and manage change better. and only 51% feel their leaders understand the challenges that they face. In your experience, where does this gap between leaders and their employees originate?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I've been there myself, in particularly as organisations grow and diversify, and also diversify in terms of work styles, so hybrid working, remote working, geographical challenges. Is as a leader, you start to get all of the surveys and pulses and all of these filters, and ultimately, as a leader, you start to be given the things that people think you want to hear. And ultimately, the real danger is leaders start to believe that to be the truth. And so we have the balloons and banners and congratulate ourselves on engagement this year is 90% and last year was 88%. And yet there was a whole game being played beneath, with people being forced to fill in surveys, people feeling the pressure, and so on and so forth. So the distance of the gap and the filtration between what's really going on at the front line and what leaders need to hear is quite common. And we need to break that down. We need to break that down by looking at the whole listening ecosystem, if you like, as I would call it, about what are the intentional ways to make sure that as a leader, as a manager, as a colleague, that you're actually getting the right sort of information and taking the right sort of response in the right sort of way at the right sort of time. So I'm not surprised that many leaders feel that they're not getting that the right quality of information, and I think there's a lot of things we can do to really rectify that. But in the workplace that we've talked about, which is more diverse, for the first time in the history of the world, more than 50% of the staff are over the age of 50. So we've got this multi-generational thing that didn't exist before, ever, in the history of the workplace. We've got the technology change that is not just a technology lay-on, it's changing the whole way we take decisions in the workplace, the whole way we work, the whole interaction between humans and technology, all the sorts of things that I'm sure you've seen. So this is a transformational time. So if ever there was a time when that listening connection between leaders and the front line needed to be really tuned, it's a real strategic asset to have right now. It's not an HR process. It's with that amount of change and that amount of transformation, a bit like when computers were first introduced into the workplace, but bigger, and that speed, the idea of a gap is just terrible. We need to bridge that gap very quickly so that you can get, and by the way, it's not always about negative things. We often think about employee feedback as, what are the problems? Is there dissatisfaction? Are we fooling ourselves to think they're all engaged? It's not just about that. It's also about the positive things, which is where are their ideas? Where are the inspiration? And what sort of things can we pull through? So I think we've got to bridge that gap and bridge it quickly. And it's a real strategic asset for organisations to do that right now.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And then from a behavioural science perspective then, because change, as you mentioned, David, is a behavioural thing, positive or negative, depending on where the feedback's coming from. So, Taliwa, your view then, and why that gap between leadership visibility, leadership blind spots when it comes to employee feedback, where that appears in the first place, what's happening internally for people that perhaps stops them from feeding back to leaders or leaders really listening?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think the first thing to ask ourselves is what behaviors are rewarded in the workplace? And so when we look over time, the behaviors that are rewarded, particularly for managers, so like middle managers, is behaviors that look like you can cope, like you're coping under pressure, right? So if a senior leader asks, how are you actually doing? Your default setting is to say, no, I'm good. It's busy, but we're good, right? That might not be the truth, but you're rewarded for looking like you're coping. And so the gap sometimes comes for people with knowing, how can I be honest without consequences? Is there a space for me in this culture to say, I have been good, my outputs have been good, but I'm so confused. I don't know what's going on with all of this change. I don't know how to communicate this with my team. The results we're seeing is not the same results we saw last year, but my team are high performing. And I think sometimes it's that gap, the gap we're seeing is really embedded in the culture. And so again, it goes back to what conversations are we asking people for them to be honest and know that actually I can be honest without consequences, because it comes from that internal thing of, if I tell my manager that I'm not coping, would they then see me as underperforming? Would they then think that actually, oh, do you know what? I don't think this person should go for that promotion or XYZ, right? So I think it's this internal factor that sometimes that's in an organizational sense, we need to look at what behaviors have been rewarded. That might be for good or for, or, negative. And is there something we can do differently so that we can get the right type of feedback at the right moment? So that we understand that actually, and this is something I always talk about, is that performance is often the last metric to drop. So before anything happens, you've already lost the person internally just because you haven't asked the right questions. So that gap keeps growing because leaders are just, we keep asking, how are you doing? Yeah, everything good? And we're seeing 90% engagement, outputs are still showing, but the person internally is suffering because they're thinking, if I actually tell the truth, what would be the consequence? So I think until we can start to change that, until we can start to have cultures that it really, psychological safety has never mattered more than 2026, right? And even more in the next 10 years, until we can start to really understand what that culture looks like for ourselves, I think that gap might just get a little bit wider.
And if I could build on that, is from what you've just described there, where there is this sort of, this facade of saying what you think you need to hear to get on.
Yeah.
Sitting beneath that lies a whole sort of iceberg of issues that probably the last place that they show is in the metric, but it's sitting there because your listening channels are not sophisticated enough. And so, we've come across this whole notion of quiet quitting, where people, they're not bringing themselves to work. They've technically resigned in their head and they're just doing the minimum to get along. Or there's health issues, or there's performance issues, discretionary effort reduces. And so this is sitting underneath the iceberg of the issue of what you've just described, that behavioural pressure on top. And then eventually you see it in your survey results and say, oh, employee engagement's gone down. Yeah, because we haven't broken down the sort of filters that you talked about. The consequences to an organisation is that if a leader, if you're believing that rhetoric of what that's created that you described, then you can have a great shock because you've believed that to be true. And actually the organisation's crumbling, high performers are leaving, and you start to see all these problems. You say, what's going on? This is an 80-90% engaged workforce. What's going on? It's because the sophistication of that listening is not there. It's not real time. It's not real. And that we've created this this balloons and banners scenario where we celebrate and tell the leaders what we think they want to hear.
So how do we ask the right questions to unpack that iceberg underneath, especially in those organisations where engagement is high, they're celebrating it, and outputs are good? And then you described the shock there of leaders. What is that shock? What is the risk that then happens in these cultures where people are saying they're okay and they're delivering and engagement is supposedly high, but actually there's more going on underneath? So I've asked two questions there, but Steve, I'll come to you first.
So I think in terms of the tip of the iceberg, I think sometimes engagement data, a lot of metrics is sort of lagging. And what we need to focus on more is the leading metrics too. So I think for organisations that are still listening annually, or God forbid running a engagement every 2 years, I think in my experience they're the ones that experience the biggest shocks because they're working with data that's 11 months out of date already. And I think HR is one of the only functions around the board table that has data lagging. I think other functions, it's more leading data, it's more real-time data. So one of the things is how can you listen more frequently? How do you create that psychological safety so people feel like they're able to speak up? And how do you do that outside of traditional engagement surveys too? So how do you tap into that frontline intelligence? How do you break down those barriers? Your leaders can connect with the front line. David spoke just then around talk to almost every time you get feedback. A big organisation, every time it goes up through a layer, it sort of gets filtered and it gets sanitised, and execs sort of manage through dashboards rather than that sort of first-hand experience and around that. So I think the more leaders can walk the floor, the more they can break down barriers, the more they can connect directly with the front line. It helps give them a full view of what it's really like, rather than that artificial sort of picture that sometimes surveys can give if they're run too infrequently or employees don't feel it's safe to really speak up and have that sort of honest perspective.
Thank you. And anything to add on that in terms of creating that psychological safety, asking the right questions and understanding, as you said, Steve, the reality?
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, like one of the things I see really work well are organizations that ask about the cost. So the cost of performance, like what is this actually costing you? So, you can take a really high performing person and they've gone through restructuring, redundancies and change, and now there's AI in there. And, a leader is going to look at that because that looks stable. That looks like it's high performance, but actually that also comes at a cost of something. So if that's cost of your mental well-being, or if that's cost of, actually sometimes you don't know how to speak up when people challenge you, when your team challenge you and say, this doesn't make sense, why are we doing what we're doing? And actually when we start creating spaces where we're asking different questions, not again, how is it going? And it's sort of like a positive type of question, so it's leading language. But actually we're asking, what is really draining you right now? What is costing you when you have to show up at, a meeting with senior stakeholders, and then you have to present a change that maybe you don't even really accept, maybe you don't really understand? What does that actually look like? And I think in those organizations, that's where you start to really hear what is going on the ground, right? That's where you start to really hear people challenging you in a new way. And now you don't just have yes men or yes women, right? You have people who are like, I know it sounds great strategically, but in reality, this is the cost to the team. This is the cost to our strategy. This is the cost to our time. And now that leader has a different perspective that maybe they never thought about before. So I think psychological safety, like you were saying, Steve, it comes with those habits, the habits of feedback. So it's consistent. We're not just doing like a 1 year, survey. But in those meetings, in those check-ins, the questioning has to be better. It has to be simple, it has to be effective, and it has to be not leading, but actually, is there a cost to this? And if there is, what is it? And I think that's where you start to really get, when we talk about psychological safety, that's where you really start to get people to open up and actually you have that timely feedback.
And David, in your experience, what is that cost that often comes up?
Well, I think it goes back to the whole notion of risk as well. What I understand realistically is if you're in HR, for example, if you happen to be in charge of the employee survey, do you really want to stand up and expose the reality of the employee voice when you've got congratulated and rewarded for the last 5 years for having 80% engagement rate or whatever? So it takes a brave, challenging person to actually say, I'm prepared to take a risk. And I think the cultural, almost psychological thing maybe, is to see risk as a cultural enabler. So it takes a brave step for somebody, maybe in HR or maybe the CEO or whoever, that says, you know what, I want the truth because the truth's going to take this organization forward. I want to understand it. I know one organization, for example, from a very impressive chief people officer who I won't mention by name, who actually went into her organization determined to find the truth and actually put little beans on the desk of every employee with a sign that said, we want you to spill the beans. And it was a laugh, but it gave, and it was, and sometimes it's done like because it creates a feeling of they must be serious. They really want something. So you've got to create the psychological safety that says leadership want you to say the truth. They want you to tell it. And it doesn't matter if this year's survey results dip, because I'd rather have the innovation, the insight, the connectivity, the authenticity, the proximity to my people. And so but I understand it takes courage. It takes courage to take a culture that's used to playing a tick box game into let's really get beneath this. But the organizations that do are going to be the ones that thrive, particularly as we're in this massive transformation where the whole of the world of work's up in the air with this partnership with AI and humans working together. Those that can restream, that can rethink the work processes, that get close to their people are going to be the ones that thrive. And those that actually just hide behind old facades are going to be the ones that really struggle. And I think in 5 years' time now, if people continue to just have sort of very transparent, very sort of superficial listening methodologies, they're going to be in serious trouble.
I think just to add, some of the CIOs I most admire, that we've been lucky enough to work with over the years, they crave for that truth. They don't want it sort of through rose-tinted glasses. They want to know the reality. And I think one of the best stories I'd heard from Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon, and he was in a board meeting and had one of their customer experience directors in. We don't have an issue with this particular product. Customers, great experience, can get through on to the call center. The wait is only a minute. And all the data presented to paint that picture. So he picked up the phone in the board meeting and called it. And it ran, and it rang, and it rang way more than a minute, past 5 minutes, past 10 minutes, really just to get to the truth. And we've got an issue. Don't hide behind sort of those smoke screens. So I think the best leaders crave for that unfiltered sort of feedback and insights in the front line. It's just been really, really hard to connect directly up until this brave new world and what AI helps to enable.
Great, thank you. So I feel like that appetite is being evidenced from leaders to move past the vanity metrics that we've used for years now in terms of measuring engagement. And what I'm understanding is that your view is we're really trying to create it now, and we're trying to get over the fear of hearing about things perhaps not working perfectly or people being entirely okay if you just ask them, how are you? So we're moving into creating engagement and getting over that fear of the vanity metrics not being better than last year. How have you seen that work well in organisations in your experience? Open to anyone.
Well, I've seen back in my day, it's 20 odd years ago, but when I was in Tesco, were in the heyday of success 20 years ago. They were opening up stores everywhere. When I joined Tesco, by the way, in HR, my mum in the north of England hadn't heard of them, because at that point, it just shows you where they were in terms of they were a small business. And the reason that they did incredibly well was because they were obsessed with customer data and insight, which fed over into being obsessed with people data and insight, and turning that into into an HR strategy and then doing something about it. So they were very good at not just listening, but then so what? And the CEO was relentless at making things operational and customer obsessed. And I give you an example. And this was 20 odd years ago, but it shows you where it was going. Remember, in security in airports, you have the happy, smiley, sad face, bang of a button. You might think, is that helpful or is that not? But back in the day, 20 odd years ago, we put like a screen in the lifts. I nearly said elevators. It shows where I live. And we had 3 questions. What should we call our new building? What should we asked questions. And at first there was some cynicism about putting this in the lift. Employees would just whack it or whatever. And there was a bit of silliness. And then when people settled down, we started to, and it was a very simple modem that sent a signal to a little laptop that said they'd all press that button, or that one, like they do in security. But it started to become very insightful about what was going on, what was being communicated in the business, what was actually happening. And that was in the Luddite days, right, where there was a simple modem that was probably making a funny faxy sound noise and sending something through. So it just strikes me that level of what I would call nowcasting has got to be where we're going now. And nowcasting is a term that I love. It was invented by, I think, Google. And the whole idea is that when you've got an epidemic, and we've just been through one, haven't we, with COVID?
Hopefully another one's not about to start.
Exactly. When we've been through an epidemic, and if you take flu, and you take the UK, right, what typically happens is people start to get flu or some sort of pandemic. And then they eventually get a doctor's appointment, if they're lucky, in about 4 weeks, right? And then they go and see the doctor. And then the doctor starts to realise there's a pattern. And then they report it to the authorities. By the time it gets to the government, there's this massive lag of here's the issue. So what Google realised is, rather than forecasting things like that, what happens if you started to look at people Googling flu remedies from pharmacies or whatever? You could actually see a pattern much quicker, and therefore you could deal with it much quicker, and you could see that there was an issue and deploy resources accordingly. And it just struck me, and that's been evolving, that whole idea of nowcasting, not forecasting. It just struck me that as surveys were always about that sort of historical piece, which I think there's a role for that strategically. I think there's a role for that analysis and that ongoing trend. But there's also something about now. There's also sort of what's happening now? Where's the flu now? And I think I've always had that in my mind. As the principle is, how do we get that into the workplace? The same as when you look at Amazon, you only have to talk about something at home and they seem to start tracking it, and suddenly it scarily starts selling you the thing that you've been talking to your partner about or whatever, right? So if they can get really good at intelligently looking at what you're interested in and what you're doing, why are we so far behind in the workplace that we wait a year to find out that you want to leave? So it just strikes me that I'm not frightened of the technology, but it has to be all of the AI and all the clever stuff along with that human-centeredness. And that reality of not replacing the line manager, being close to the front line and so on. But we've got to use that intelligence to get way sharper in delivering a response to people in a way that doesn't take a year. I expect Amazon to figure out what I'm interested in minutes. And yet my employer years. That's not acceptable,
And
right?
actually, that's what we expect even in our personal world, right? Like, it only takes 5 minutes to do a deep research on something. Like, it's the same if you have a headache. Or, I mean, you go to Google, Dr. Google or ChatGPT, you want a recipe. And we're so used to it in our personal life as a behavioral pattern. But when it comes to work and when it comes to feedback, it's as if we're still almost like, 5 years behind, where we're just relying on like, okay, historical data, what has happened, and how can that actually forecast what we need to do as an organization. Whereas I think, like you were saying, there is a real opportunity because of AI as well to really capture the now data, just as we do in our day to day.
Yeah, I think 100%. I think you've touched on that, haven't you? Our expectations aren't informed around 9 to 5. It's the whole world around us, how we're interacting, and consumer grade apps. That's what we're expecting from work. And I think with employee listening, and this is, we spoke about traditional listening, which has a place, getting structured feedback in confidential environments, allowing you to almost create a cultural MOT for the business. Now to then sort of direct your focus strategically, that's not going away. But I think one limitation of that approach is there's a whole sort of cottage industry built around the survey. And it's weeks or months in planning in most organizations. It's a big project and a program. I think what we need to do with employee listening is move it from being a program or a project into a habit that's embedded in day to day. We need to give leaders tools. So if I have implemented the change, we're doing a rollout of AI, we launched a new product, new process, sort of rolling out a new format at a retail like Tesco's. We need to give leaders tools where they're able within minutes to go out and get that feedback. Because if it's not minutes, they're not going to do it in structured ways. And that's where I think AI creates a real opportunity to take listening that has been for too long just the sort of almost the realms of HR with surveys, and put it into the hands of every operational leader, so they can really capture that frontline intelligence. They can almost walk the floor virtually, bridge that sort of gap that we spoke about earlier on.
And imagine the utility of it, though, of getting an immediate answer, right? So if I'm speaking as an HR person for a minute, when we used to do employer branding, we had to go around to employers and say, what do you think of working here? What's your thoughts of working here? That would take about a year. I think we did a global piece once with McDonald's and considered it to be a record that we got global feedback in 45 days, right? That was a world record probably for 120 countries and 2 million staff, right? So imagine you're doing employer branding and you want to know what all your people really think, right? Imagine the power of that, getting that now, versus sitting for a year, well, a year or maybe two in the old currency of getting that information. Imagine I've just done a conference and I want to know what they all think, what was good, what was bad, and getting that answer now, what they all think. So not only is it motivating to my employees that think they've got that access straight to, you're listening to me. I often hear organizations talk about, there's a bit of a survey fatigue. There's not a survey fatigue. There's a response fatigue, right? Yeah. There's a response fatigue, which is I'll keep talking to you if I think you're listening to me. But if I think you're doing nothing with what I say, I'm going to get very bored with this survey, right? So it's not the survey's problem, it's the response problem to the survey. So my point being is, imagine all the different processes that used to take years. If we can get opinion, not on a product, on a place, on a promotion, on a thing I'm doing right now, and then do something about it, I have to do something about it, then that is a real thrill. And then there'll be no survey fatigue.
There's something that comes to my mind on that, is that because that's a massive opportunity for organizations. But the challenge that comes off the back of that is what to do with that immediate feedback. One of the things I always see, one of the behavioral patterns is that, rightly or wrongly, sometimes it's almost like organizations like the fact that it takes a year. It buys them time. It buys them time to do a strategy, do another meeting, do another roundtable, do another meeting, and then, drag the whole thing for 45 days to a year or to 2 years. And now AI challenges that status quo to say, no, you can do something now. And it is going to bring up boldness. It's going to bring up courage. It's going to bring up you being a little bit more, just being able to take risk. And that is pushing the boundaries of organizational cultures, because not all organizations are happy to take risk. You know, when I even deal with like the public sector and with government and with charities, you know, there's just this red tape that is always there. And so when you're now bringing a technology like AI to say we can capture data in the now and you can do something with it, for a lot of organizations, that challenge is going to be like, this is scary.
And I think it's not the technology that's the barrier and the
Yeah.
lag. It's culturally, isn't
Yeah.
it? What are we ready for,
Yeah,
and how do we
exactly.
on the journey? I think what it does do is also it almost democratizes listening.
Yeah.
You haven't got to be someone in a project team designing the survey questions that goes through committees and committees around what's the exact word in the question 27. Instead, it allows leaders at any level to connect with their employees on a whole range of topics. And what I get excited about is really thinking about your employees who are closest to the customers. They have the answers. They know what's working, where the friction is, why that change has worked or hasn't worked around that. And if we can use AI and tools like Dialogue to really connect with them in ways that haven't been able to before, capture that feedback on what the customers like about that recent change, sort of what barriers are there for you being more successful. I think we can make it much more interesting as well and much more rounded, and give employees a chance to influence how their work gets done and get much more practical feedback in terms of their day-to-day working environment, so we can make their work life better too.
Yeah.
And you know, I'm going to throw one in, right? Which is, how bored are we all with town hall meetings in organisations? Is it just me? Right, they're boring, right? They're set up, they're written by the communications department, everybody's plastic, nobody's telling you what you really, there's no real proper questions, they're all laid up questions. And so you go to it and you might as well just read a script, right? There's no personality. And of course, I'm not completely decrying town halls as a way of downloading information, but it's probably not much better than a newsletter. The reality is that organisations need to step back, because this is a real strategically important thing to do, and do an audit of the listening channels in the organisation, just like Tesco would for its customers. Like, how are we listening? Like Amazon would, like, where are we listening? And it's probably duplicitous, right? So there's probably like, how are we making sure that the types of feedback is digestible by our line manager to do something with? Yeah. So are we asking crazy questions? Mm-hmm. So we already know that 90% of surveys out there in the market were designed for people behind desks, and 90% of the workers don't work behind desks. Yeah. So immediately you've got a branch manager or something that's trying to translate corporate language to the crew members and staff of the store, and it makes no sense to him whatsoever, and everybody congratulates themselves. Well, you're not arming the line manager with anything they can work with, 'cause it's not even their language, it's not their terminology. So you've got to look at everything from how you design the survey, the language, and is it outside in? Is it customer driven, the employee being the customer? And then the next thing is, where's this nowcasting? Where's the immediacy? How am I feeling the pulse? How am I getting my line managers close to the front line? When I worked at GlaxoSmithKline, or SmithKline Beecham as it was then, we used to go out with the reps. I used to learn more going out with the reps, the sales reps, than anything in terms of what was going on, what was the reality. The survey might tell you, what's going on, but going out with the rep tells you why and what's going on behind it. So I think you've got to have a look at how close are you as management, as leaders, to the front line, to the flow of work in this new world. And then where's the surveys coming in? Are they rightly designed? And then where's my nowcasting? Where's my now feel? And so on and so forth. So I think you've got to look at the whole span. And I think that there is an over-reliance on boring town halls and just on the survey when it needs more.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up on two things that we've spoken about: the nowcasting, immediacy, and meeting expectations of the pace of understanding, not lagging data but leading data, and how. But before we get into that, it's been mentioned a couple of times about the proximity to the front line, walking the floor, and the importance of that. Tolu, I want to come to you from a connection and human behaviour perspective. We're going back now, but why is walking the floor still something that we know leaders should be doing? Why does it make all the difference for engagement and understanding the reality of frontline? And then we'll come back to how do we do it in the modern, dispersed workforce?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to bore you with the science, right? But when we look at human beings on a normal scale, how do human beings connect? from when we were toddlers to adults. Emotion, connection, imprinting, essentially. So we see that with animals, it's the same with humans. And there's something about visibility, meaningful visibility, of seeing the leader on the floor, right? Because now there's a connection that is different. There's a sort of emotional connection that is like, okay, head, heart, hands, right? It's this thing that happens to how we engage and how we show up at work. And it's almost like, okay, I can either ask the leader questions or we can have a conversation. There's just a different level of connection. But I think sometimes the issue with, or, you know, when leaders could get this wrong, because it's tempting to just show up, right? It's tempting to just walk the floor. And what we're seeing that is changing now is the difference with leaders who walk the floor with ego, with, you know, a level of identity. So I'm the leader who knows everything. I have all the solutions. Like, we should be asking these questions, even though it doesn't relate to, you know, your context at work, versus leaders who walk the floor with curiosity. You know best. What's actually happening here for you? And I think the difference, again, I would always bang on about this, is about the type of questions we're asking people, because that really goes back to how they connect and actually what they take away from that situation. So when that, you know, shop floor manager, worker, operational leader goes back home, they're not thinking, oh, you know what, David walked the floor today. I really liked his shirt. They're thinking, I really had a good conversation with him because he asked about my situation. He asked about the challenges I was facing. And it's so funny because he wasn't just bringing solutions. He was just listening. And he was listening differently. And I think that level of connection is what we're used to from toddler age. We see that with adult connection, and adults who form really healthy relationships, is this, you know, security in the attachment of actually seeing the adult, the parent, feeling listened to, feeling seen, feeling heard, and being like, oh, actually, I really like my mum and dad. and it's those same behaviors we then carry into the workplace as adults. And I think that's why that sort of visibility in a meaningful way is so important as leaders, not, again, with ego, with fear, with identity, with saying, all right, I know it all, but with that level of curiosity and leading with that as the intention.
So these leaders who have that curiosity, who want to do this, who really buy into the value of human connection to move their organisations forward, and they understand the relationship with business performance, but they're running a multi-site operation. People are everywhere. They could not get around every shop floor, or if they did, that's all they could do. They wouldn't be able to do anything else in their day-to-day. How are they doing it now? So
I've seen some crazy stuff over the years, and I imagine, David, you've seen a bit more being at organisations the size of McDonald's and Tesco's. I've seen a founder of a very big retail discount store have a helicopter and fly up and down the UK. Obviously, that's not for everybody. I think in terms of what we're saying to begin with is you've got two things we're trying to bring together. You've got employees craving for that connection, want the leaders to be more visible, want to be involved in shaping change, want to have a voice, and have the answers of closest to the customers, see the friction, what's working, what isn't working. And you have not every leader, but the best leaders that want to approach this with curiosity, understand they don't know it all, and want to sort of bridge that gap between their strategy and how's it really sort of been executed and where the rubber meets the road. But up until recently, the technology hasn't been there to bridge that gap. And leaders may do site visits. I worked at one, and what would happen is executive directors would visit the location nearest to where they live, or next to head office, and over-index based on that small amount of feedback that wasn't representative around that. And I think the best way to think about it now is with the advent of AI and new technology is how can you bridge that gap? And this is one of the things we are super passionate about at WorkBuzz. We've been really thinking about this over the last 18 months and piloting different things with some of our key clients. And we've come up with a concept called Dialogue, which is beautifully simple. And the way this works is, as a leader, I record a really short video. So it literally makes me visible. My face is on camera. I can add a bit of sort of narrative rolling context. I ask a question. And it could be as simple as, if you take example of Tesco's, after Christmas trading period, how did it go? What could we learn what can we learn and do better for next time round? Or it could be we launched a new product or changed the process, or we're thinking about sort of making a change. What do you think? And crowdsourcing that feedback. So a really, really short question video, so it's authentic, it's visible. Employees, and we know employees are half of them are on TikTok or on YouTube, but surveys aren't as engaging. They can respond their way through video, voice note, or text. So we make it about employees, make it inclusive. What AI enables us to do now, in literally last year, which wasn't even possible before, was we can take all that feedback, we can transcribe thousands, tens of thousands of videos, voice notes at once. We can use AI that we can train an organization's own context, own language. It feels personalized, it's linked to their strategy. So within minutes, give that leader a summary of what's working, what the risks are, what's not working, and the top 2 or 3 things to do going forwards. And that is a game changer, because what it allows leaders to do is to almost walk the floor virtually at scale in a way it's not humanly possible if you've got hundreds or thousands of locations or hybrid working around that. And the real big difference where the rubber meets the road is they can close that loop. So with engagement surveys, I'm a big fan of engagement surveys, not going to go away because of that structured feedback, that confidential forum, that's important for employees. But often it takes weeks or months before employees see any change. With dialogue, we've had leaders go out asking for feedback on a Monday. Employees respond on the Tuesday. They watch the AI summary on the Wednesday. With one of our clients nationwide, within 74 minutes, get feedback across 4,000 people across all their branches in the UK. Within 70 minutes, record a video saying, this is what we've heard, this is what I've heard, this is what you told me is working, and this is what you told me I need to fix, and here are the whole steps. And for an employee who's used to sort of completing the survey, and it may not be until 6-7 weeks' time I hear anything meaningful, I hear that within 70 minutes. It's a game changer. So I think the thing I get really excited about as a founder is we've seen challenges and problems with employee listening, and we've got to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But those challenges around, it takes too long for employees to hear any meaningful change. The whole way of giving feedback doesn't feel inclusive, doesn't create engagement. So now with these advancements in technology and AI, we're able to solve those problems in meaningful ways, and really in a lot of that operation intelligence, really tap into what the frontline know, and they have the answers. And now we have leaders that want to know those answers, that are curious. It's not every leader, but those that are, now have the tools to bridge that gap. So it's such an exciting time to be employee listening.
That's really exciting. And I'm going to come back to that point on meaningful action and the response fatigue thing that came up earlier as well. Before I do that, David, I'm going to come to you. In terms of your experience, how would a tool like Dialogue and that ability to get masses of qualitative feedback to leadership within hours have changed an experience that you've had over the years?
I think, whether it comes to global employer branding, whether it comes to when you're brand new as a chief HR officer, the number one thing you need to do is show that you understand the voice of your people and what's going on. That's the foundation of your strategy. That's the data that's irrefutable. Here's what our people say. So you can imagine how effective you could ramp up as a chief HR officer going into an organization and getting that level of insight, or whether it's branding, or whether it's dealing with leadership issues or challenges, or even opportunities driving innovation, etc., turnaround, transformation in organizations. Virtually any application that you're working on as a CHRO in a modern progressive business, it would feed in. And now I think through the simplicity of how I could get so many voices into my connection, and doing it in a human way, as you say. I've learned a lot from marketing over the years, marketing science, and I think HR's missed quite a bit of it, but it is all about proximity, familiarity, similarity. I trust things that I feel close to. That a boss that it might be 1,000 miles away, but I feel connected to him or her because he's interested in me or he asks my opinion. So I think even in a virtual world I oversaw 120 countries, is the fact that, yes, you can't be in 120 countries, yes, you can't be, but to create a sense of proximity, which video gives you, to a degree, the body language and the authenticity. And then the other thing I would say is this isn't about making us all into media stars, right? We don't all have to be brilliant on video. In fact, some of the most powerful things I've seen in the past are where line managers come on and say, I've made a mistake. and I can't do what you're asking, or I can't do what you're all asking. You've all asked for this and I can't do it, and here's why. Or whether they've been actually a bit naff. You know, when they come on camera and it's really like, you can see that they're not all staged and all whatever. I want to see them naturally on the way to the train station telling me, I think I've got a problem, I'd love your ideas, right? I want to feel that authenticity. And you feel it every day on Facebook and whatever. We know what we're looking for. So, we have to treat our employees as, adults, right? And so let's not stage them. Let's not be performative. Let's just be what. So some of the line managers that I think will be most effective using video are those that are actually not overperformed, are those that are natural, that have never done it before, that are not all clued in, that are authentic and not perfect. And so I think there's a real role. So to answer your question, I think it would have speeded up a lot of my processes, particularly in distributed workforces. It would have got me the answer quicker. It would have made me feel much more proximity what's going on. And particularly as a new CHRO, what a gift. Imagine coming into an organization as a new CHRO and you're concerned about what people think of you and being the biggest listener that the company's ever seen. I mean, what a position for that role. What a positioning for that role. What a scene to set for the rest of your colleagues. The other thing is I think, like any change and transformation, is you always get pioneers and you always get people who want to be first at the Apple Store for the new iPhone, no matter what it is. They want to be first, right? So you do get people who always want to put their hand up to volunteer first. And they're good to test things on. But you then get the ones that are usually more socially networked, who are actually a bit more believable, who you need to convince, and then they'll have a go, and then the rest will follow. And then you'll get the people at the end that say, I'm not doing it until I'm forced to do it, right? So you need to find those advocates in the organisation and pick them carefully. Not the first to the Apple Store, but the people that are really credible, get them to try new modern listening techniques, and then watch everybody else think, oh my God. And then the social proof of their story and their example and the value that they've created will carry through the organisation. So not to say that the mavericks aren't helpful to test things, but you really want those, like, the people that you just sort of trust in an organisation. If they say it's good, everybody thinks it must be good. Get some of those involved, and they're probably not the most media savvy people. Get the person that's a year from retirement that pretends he can't use his phone on a video, and you watch the impact, and make it messy, right? And you watch the impact on the employees, see him or her do it, and you'll see the impact, right? So it doesn't have to, this isn't all about media showmanship and presenteeism in that way. This is about authentic. Yeah. Like, use the technology to make it human.
100%. It sounds like one of the biggest learnings from our last 18 months, really trying to create this and create the future, is around the more makeup, the more lights, the less people engage with it, because you set a really high bar. Right. You set this artificial expectations, and where we're seeing the best engagement, leader is on their phone, around their laptop, messy background, or in the store walking out, because it really sort of sets that human level around, this is okay, you don't need to have lights and camera and make up your ends as well. So that's one of the biggest takeaways we've seen. And we've seen a lot of organizations, this is a brand new kind of muscle. They sort of, listening to more organizations is a survey, which in too many organizations is HR. And what we're saying now, we've got a chance to democratize that. We've got a chance to say to every leader, particularly with diverse and distributed teams, you've got a way to listen to those, to crowdsource their feedback within minutes. It doesn't take you a whole project. You can literally launch one of these in 3 or 4 minutes and you're away. But that's a new muscle to build. So what we've sort of found in our organizations who are helping us to sort of create dialogue over the last 18 months has been, you start slowly, you start with those champions. And the game changer is this: as soon as people see the speeds of the insights and closing the loop, I want a piece of that. We have one example from a client that piloting dialogue and signing off their contract. We had an email that's from the finance team on the email trail, and they have been involved in the dialogue pilot so far. I like this. I've sort of seen as an internal sort of thread there, and so this is different. This is fast. But when do we get access? Because it does feel so different. But it's not an overnight change. You don't go from not having this operational sort of listening muscle. It takes time to build. You have to do it gradually, authentically. But then you create something really, really powerful. You shift listening from a program or a project. It's just how we work.
To a habit.
Into a habit, yeah. And that's what we're really trying to sort of create.
It's funny you should use the word democratization. I don't mean funny. Democratization of sort of listening, because a few years back, I think probably, I don't know, I want to say about 8 or 9 years ago, democratization of leadership was a theme around how leadership was seen as something that you train as you become quite senior. And actually leadership's all about frontline leadership, and it's not about managers and then you suddenly become a leader and the training becomes really inspirational. No, it needs to, and it was all about pushing down leadership, right? And squashing that notion that you only become a leader after you've done managerial, right? And it just strikes me that we did democratize a lot of leadership training and realize the importance of frontline. But we didn't. But the biggest skill they have is listening, and the process of listening wasn't democratized at the same time, right? And so it just now's the time, right? With all the change and transformation that we're going through, is as we've tried to push down leadership behaviours at the front end, we need to catch up with listening and communication in a way that's not, artificial like it is right now.
The first time the technology is here, that enables it.
Right.
We couldn't have done what we can do now 2 or 3 years ago.
Right. But the thing that the technology is good because it's going to create loads more data, loads more real time, hopefully a lot more proximity. So even though I'm working in Taiwan or somewhere, I feel that closeness because my boss asks me questions and this, that, and the other. But there still has to be, because one of the downsides right now with AI and technology, there's a lot of upsides, lots of data, lots of analysis, make things a lot easier than it used to be. But there needs to be that thinking time. And there is still an equity right now there's a relational equity that needs to be in the workplace that needs to be built, and there is that thinking time. The speed and the data and the quantity of AI is fabulous, but we've got to build in the time for leaders to be thinking and building relationships and not missing out on that human centricity that sits on the back of that quantity of data. And I think, and that's about giving the leaders, I think you raised it earlier, giving the leaders the right language and the right tools and the right support and the right time to think through what they've seen to then do something about it.
I'm so happy you've mentioned that, David, because it's probably one of the most fundamental skills that we need today is the ability to think. Just to think better. And, most organizations are not actually set up for that because it's like a running joke. You just have meetings after meetings. And there's an opportunity here when you have data at scale. And then it's about what do we do with this, with the results, with this insights. And I think actually just building in that sort of like reflective time, that critical thinking time to challenge the data as well. To say, actually, is this, have you heard this? Have you felt this? And you have people in the room, hopefully, from different departments, and then you can actually think better together. And I think it's one of the skills that we're missing now. The more we're evolving with AI, the more we're evolving with data and technology and the access to technology, if we don't actually stop and pause to say, what are we thinking about this? How can we challenge this? What does this actually mean for us? And, where do we want to be in the next 12 months, whatever? Then there's going to be a real gap that actually we're all thinking like Claude or ChatGPT or the next AI tool, and that human is lost because we just take whatever the AI says and we're like, okay, this is truth, this is Bible, we're going to do this, and then the results don't always align with that.
I think you get quite a vanilla world, don't you? I think converges over time on that. So I think it's around our perspective, trying to use technology to turbocharge what we need it to turbocharge. So that sort of analysing thousands of bits of feedback or voice notes over something we weren't able to do before. That's not practically possible to go through to another page. But amplifying that human connection, getting leaders to connect with their teams through video, and to close the feedback loop, even on an individual level. So I think it's a really, really important point, and we have to walk that tightrope, but use AI to amplify what we bring as unique human beings. Never lose that. But turbocharge what's possible around that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if I was thinking about a journey for myself when I was a chief people officer, going back now with hindsight and with everything that we've talked about today, I'd probably start with all the survey data and the insights and say, show me the trends, show me what's going on, right? So you get all that sort of strategic stuff and that perspective. And then I'd probably want to go out into stores or restaurants, whatever, and sniff it and talk to people and say what's happening, what's going on, and whatever. And then in my head, I'd come up with a hypothesis that I think what I'm hearing from the amount of stores I could go in, which let's just say I could go into 20 stores. And then I'd say, I've got a hypothesis. And then I'd go out on Dialogue and ask 2 million people what they think of this topic, of my hypothesis, right? Not that it was positioned rightly. Yeah. But and that might not be the perfect journey, but I'd be thinking through that journey of how do I use all the channels to get me the perfect, and then I'd come up with my strategy, and then I'd test it, and then I'd check it, and then I'd learn from it and start again. And so you could see a cycle that becomes really cool, where you start with the big picture, then you get your frontline feedback and get out there and feel what's really going on as to why. Then you use a dialogue to check questions and get ideas around it. And that's often a problem as well, by the way, which is, and I'm seeing a lot of laziness around this, dare I say, around well-being, which is it's easy to go and run apps on well-being. Tick, we've done well-being, we've got another 3 apps. But the thinking is not there, and the listening is not there. So you're running at something without the listening. And so I think there's a little journey here in how to build HR strategy that's really cool, using all these different listening methodologies to build a as perfect as it will be, strategy.
So let's talk more about closing the loop and taking that action then in a way that does account for all those listening mechanisms, different channels, ways of learning, testing the hypothesis. Say you use dialogue, you test the hypothesis, you understand whether it's got legs. Then what next in terms of communicating the intentions and then taking action? Obviously, it's going to depend on the hypothesis. It's going to depend on the data and the feedback that you're gathering. But could you tell me an example of where you've seen it done well in a way that actually drives and improves engagement?
I can start there. So I think we discussed earlier on in terms of employees' expectations have really shifted and been morphed by technologies outside of work. So that immediacy, I've been able to do chats online with Amazon or support, or that dopamine hit from social media, or reels of sort of summarizing content. I can't disconnect from that when I'm in work. I can't separate on other robots. I think that speed is what employees are craving for. Whereas listening, it tends to be weeks or months sometimes before anything. So we want to use technology to bridge that gap, but it does need a bit of time for pause of thought. So I think with David said, you need to think about what are those key areas, if even without technology, if I was walking the floor, if I had 3 locations rather than 300 or 3,000, what are those key questions I want to find out? So if we've launched a new product, what are our customers thinking? Do you have the right training to sell the product? Do you have enough stock? If it's new processes, new systems, I want to be asked about questions around those if I've got 30 people or 30,000. Technology is just enabled to do that at more scale. I then think you need to, again, major on areas you can influence. So if you can't change your pay bandings next quarter, then ask sort of directly about that. Ask and make it as much as possible about the employee's world. What's relevant and tangible to them? What's going to make their life easier? Link it to the day-to-day work and operations, as well as the deeper sort of areas of engagement surveys measure. And the key bit then is that responsibility for once you go out asking for feedback to close that loop rapidly. Doesn't always have to be 70 minutes like that nationwide example. It could be 2-3 days. It could be a week, 2 weeks. But really anchoring expectations and realizing we have to do better employee feedback and close loop ideally within hours or days rather than sort of weeks and months.
Yeah, and I think actually just on that point is that, again, earlier on I talked about the behaviors that are rewarded in the workplace. And I think, the danger of when we use new technology or, new tools and employees don't see the responses that are, basically they don't see a change. It's like, okay, this was a great tool and I gave honest feedback, but then nothing happened, or actually expectations are not even clear. Like, when am I going to hear back on this?
It's worse than not doing anything.
Exactly. And I think actually that piece there of actually how do you close the loop well and then making sure that that's clear for everyone of, okay, we're going to set expectations. Now, it might also not be what you want to hear, because that's what happens with feedback. It's always polarized. You know, you never get everybody saying, this is 99%, everyone is on board. It's like that usually doesn't happen, right? So when you have polarized feedback, it's saying, I'm going to set expectations here. It still might not be what you want to hear, but this is when, we expect it to have a change or a strategy or things like that. And I think that's what builds that culture that we were talking about, that actually people do want to lead with curiosity, but also give honest feedback, because it's like, okay, at least I know something is going to be done about this, and it's not just ASA.
I think just to add to that, sometimes it's about explaining what you can't do,
Yeah.
but the rationale why. So you've asked for blue, all we have is red in stock, whatever, and then there's a rationale behind it, but at least listening, you're playing back why you can't, and then employees feel like they've got a voice. You have listened, even if you can't always action it.
Just to build on what was said, I completely agree with all those points. I think a few years ago we might have been judging ourselves on the response to listening, right? So you listen to your customers and employees, and there's always a little interesting piece there, because I think one thing that dialogue does bring, and what the technology now brings, is the ability of the closeness of the data between what your customers are experiencing, what your employees are saying. So I think there's a big opportunity there that insight can correlate, can ask similar questions. In fact, you've already said your employee questions could be about the customer experience. So I think there's a closeness of that insight, which has struggled for years to be put together, because usually ops own part of the data, HR. So the silos in the organisation haven't helped to unlock the value of data from different sources. This does, because it's not an HR process, right, as such. So there's that. And then I think we used to measure ourselves on, speed of response. How quickly did you hear something back from the employee? So, and probably congratulate ourselves if you're in one of the few where you hear anything, right? Anything back. And how many organisations have got employees that say we heard nothing back or felt that nothing was happening? I think we've gone beyond that, dare I say, even though the ratings may be variable, into it's not just the response, but the quality of response. It's a QR now. It's not just an R. And I think the quality of response is not just did they get back to me, but in what way did they get back to me? And, the old saying that people will forget what you said, but will never forget how you made them feel, which came from a famous activist alongside Martin Luther King in the US, it is true, which is have people got a sense of feeling and belief that if I raise an issue around here, or if I raise an idea around here, somebody will listen. And if the answer to that's no, that's base camp stuff, right? Somebody heard it. And then is somebody going to respond to it? Probably next level. But is the quality of the response, even if, to your point, if the answer's no, or I can't do that, or I'm sorry we messed up. So it's the quality of the response. And what does a quality of response look like to me? It looks like whenever I have an issue with Amazon, I expect them to respond and resolve it and give me a refund in 10 minutes, right? Minutes. I expect immediacy. I expect it to be appropriate. I expect somebody's listened, almost to the point you believe they've really read it. And I understand there's technology involved, but I also expect a bit of a personal touch now and again. And so that's what quality response looks like. So I think the technology gives us great opportunity, but as I say, it's got to have that human centricity to it, and it's got to have that think time.
That's why leaders have to close the loop. No robot can do that, no automated workflow, because then you lose the whole essence of what you're trying to create, that connection.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think what we're calling for is leaders to get comfortable with authenticity, be okay adding their sort of human, not perfect approach to showing up for their people. And I was part of a discussion group in a webinar recently where someone was telling a story saying, I'm so lucky to have the leader that I do. The CEO of my organisation's great because they'll just write and tell stories and we'll put it in the newsletter, and people love it because they feel like humanly connected to our CEO. And this was an internal head of internal comms sort of feeding this back. And let's just sort of put those two together and then talk to the HR leaders or chief people officers who are perhaps feeling frustrated where they don't have that same situation. Maybe the CEO of their organisation doesn't buy into that as much, or they aren't showing up as authentically in a raw human way in the way they communicate with their people, what would we say to those HR leaders who are really trying to push forward connection, engagement, and they know that leadership authenticity is important for that?
I think, I'll start by saying there has never been a more burning platform than there is right now relative to change in organisations. I'm coming across CEOs that said, look, I don't know how, but we've got technology now, so I need to remove 6,000 people and figure out how to make it work with the rest that I've got left. So you're hearing that sort of radical, sort of rightly or wrongly, you're hearing that sort of radical shift. Everybody recognises that AI, it wasn't many years ago when I was in the, probably during my tour, but in the Middle East and beyond, where I was giving lectures that AI is real and it is coming and will it impact jobs. I mean, we were talking about that a few years ago, right? And now I don't think anybody's sitting thinking, is AI part of our life anymore? And so the point is that the wave of change that's coming in with this partnership, couples counselling, as I've called it, between humans and technology, is causing a massive rethink into this wave of change in the workplace that I started with. And so every CEO knows that. On top of that, you're on the back of COVID, where even a lot of CFOs, as well as CEOs, realise the impact of the people bit not working quite the same. And so if ever there was a platform of showing the organisation change, it's now, because everybody realises it's all going very differently. And all decisions are being taken differently, and technology, this is not a layer on of technology. This is a complete radical change of the workplace. So we've had all of that. We've had the disruption of COVID, thinking about hybrid working, all of that sort of stuff. So I think it behoves us as CHROs then to grasp that opportunity to show what's possible relative to human and technology, and thinking of workflows differently. And I would go bold, but then I would, which is I don't think org design is going to work anymore, because that's very boxy and old-fashioned and static. It's all about workflows and humans and technology. So we need to get rid of org design in the way it is. I don't think that's working at all. I don't think some of the ways in which we've built cultures is working. I don't think some of the ways in which we've had these surveys that we haven't really listened properly is working. So there's a lot we can go at, all to support the change that organisations are facing, of which there is no question in the CEO's mind that things are changing. So I think we can step up. I will tell you that Moderna, you've heard, one of the 2 injections for COVID. They were, I think, one of the first to claim that they've merged digital and HR into one function. And then there was another big company last week in the US that put 2,000 digital people under HR. And you get a lot of HR people saying, oh, is this exciting? Are we going to take over IT? And I said, I don't think that's the point. The point is that the way that you've got boxy IT in one box and HR in another box, and them putting systems in and you looking at the implications, something needs to change. And organisations are not equipped to deal with the wave of change that we're coming through now. So there's a big change agenda for those CHROs that have got the ambition to take on the change. A key part of change, listening, especially when there's pace, especially when there's such change coming. So I think if ever there was a learning and listening at the heart of it, it's now. But it's going to take a lot of courage, because this is not the old world of CHROs in a box. This is CHROs that are tech interested, that are hugely curious, that behaviourally re-engineer things, that think like engineers 1 minute and technologists the next. So it is a different type of role and a different type of job, and I think it's very exciting, but probably not for everybody.
And I think to your point as well, Camilla, with that example that you gave, right, with the head of internal comms and, having that CEO that sort of shares and people feel connected to the culture, I definitely think there's a place for that. But I don't think that's the only way to build that level of proximity. Mm-hmm. Now, again, just to take it outside of work, and we look at a relationship between a parent and a child, right? I could tell my daughter, this is the right thing to do, this is the moral thing to do, you should always wear white socks to school. She doesn't listen to me. But when her uncle says it, it's like it's brand new information. She's like, did you know Uncle Toby said I should wear white socks to school? I've been telling you that for 5 years, love. And there's something there around actually who are the other leaders that people really trust, because it always doesn't have to come from the CEO. And I know that might seem controversial, but it's just the way humans connect. There's something around that sort of like top leader, versus the head of marketing, the head of operations, the that whatever the title might be, and I think it's the job of like the chief, HR officer to notice who those people are in organizations, to identify them, because they might not have the title of C-suite, but they're influential, they're impactful, people get them, and that's what gets people moving. When they feel connected to that leader, that's why they stay. The second that leader goes, no matter how inspirational the CEO might be, they might also leave because they're like, I don't feel connected to anyone in this organization. So I would just encourage, HR officers or who, L&D practitioners who are thinking, oh, but our CEO doesn't really do this or CEO doesn't do that. It doesn't have to end there. I think the job is to really have this landscape and identify who are the key influencers and champions within your organization and actually use them to build that culture that you want. And hopefully maybe the CEO would also catch up, who knows? But yeah.
And can I build on that?
Yeah, of
Because that is such a great point. And very common, I suspect, as well, where the CEO may not be enlightened relative to value of creation through people. But the importance as well, in my experience, is the leaders can say whatever they want, and it's important, and they can cast a sort of cloud or a shadow or a sunshine over the organisation. But the only way to really move the culture of an organisation, if that's the goal of the CHRO, is what we call the Middle Earth. Right? So you can have whatever words you want at the top, and the bottom generally, so I don't like the word bottom, but those at the front end of the organisation typically want leadership, they want directionality, and they want to be led. The Middle Earth are the ones that usually stop stuff happening, and they don't follow. And so if you can get to the Middle Earth of an organisation, and very often find the firelighters that are within it that can move it, is the whole organisation goes with it. Sometimes, despite the senior people that sit above them. And that's how you move it. And sometimes you see organisations, they get all the stuff messaged at the top, but it's not happening. And at the bottom that are dissatisfied. It's the Middle Earth that don't want to shift because they're comfortable, because they're waiting for retirement, whatever it is, right? There's not a movement. And so there are ways of thinking about, how do I move Middle Earth? How do I get that lot moving? And because if that lot moves, the other lot will follow and be supported through it, and the top will may be surprised, even at the expense of the top, dare I say, at times.
And we've sort of seen that pattern with Dialogue, exactly what you just described as that take up. It rarely do we start with CEO. It's normally the last place to go because new technology, customers want to see it working locally to begin with in their department, and gradually it organically grows until someone sees the power of that insight within minutes, and a leader closing the loop, wherever that leader is, team manager through to director level and C-suite, but someone with a leadership capacity close that loop. I think one of the questions I sometimes get asked is around leadership visibility, but also I'm really trying to get the business to buy into engagement. I think with engagement, we spent a lot of time talking about the links of engagement and business KPIs, whether it's customer satisfaction, retention, and so on, and creating that kind of narrative. I think with operational listening, it's different. So I think if I was next to my CEO and I was having to educate them why operational listening is important, I'd flip it around and almost imagine, Tudor or David, if you can clone yourself and sit down alongside every member of your sales organization on a one-to-one basis and ask them what's getting in the way of winning more customers, or your customer service reps, what are the biggest barriers you're facing to deliver an amazing customer experience, or one of the most important change programs we're trying to roll out, why is it not really embedded, or we're making a big change, what do you think of that beforehand? Imagine if you clone yourself and have all those conversations like gold dust. So and that's what operational listening is really about. It's learning from the front line, what's in their heads, it's bridging that gap between strategy and execution. And it's really sort of break it down, getting close to the front line, have the best ideas, see the friction, see the opportunities hiding in plain sight. So it's not listening for the sake of it, it's listening to answer those really, really important questions that's going to help the organization be much more successful.
And that's a really important differential of operational listening, because I've seen founders of organizations who want to impress their investors and they see that the way to impress their investors is to get into best companies, great places to work survey, whatever, right? And so, because it looks good, it gets in the newspapers and whatever. I think with what I know now, and with what I see as capability now, if I was an investor, I'd ask a different question. I'd have different questions. Forget all of the glorification of the balloons of your rankings in all of these happiness surveys. Mm-hmm. Tell me the quality of your operational listening and what you're doing to make it even better, right? Because that is what's going to, for as an investor, that's how close you're going to get to getting the employees to the customer to make the value to return on investment. That other one is just like using surveys in the old world, which is just a game.
So the vanity metric.
It's a vanity metric, which I have to say, as a founder, I could see why you would want to do that to impress an investor, because that's a vanity metric that's recognizable. But actually, it should start with the investors, is ask a different question, which is ask about the quality of operational listening. And because that's what's made companies really successful, time and time again. That's what made Amazon successful. That's what made Tesco successful, and so on and so forth. Not just retailers. And from that, judge the quality of that answer. And I think you've made a good point, a differential between operational listening versus vanity.
So if someone heard that question then, what does the quality of your operational listening look like? Yeah. What should they start to think about? If this is a new concept for them, say, where should their minds be going to start answering that question?
Well, given, that we've said in this conversation that strategically, listening is an absolute core skill, capability in what what we are going through, because it's the only thing. Organizations are not moving at the pace of design relative to the technology and the changes in the workplace that's happening now. So the organizations are already out of design. They're already defunct design. It's like having an old Apple phone and you're currently using it, right? They're already out of design and they can't move quick enough to be ahead. So listening is the only way to start to get these organizations ready for where we're going and so on. So what's the quality of the operational listening? I think it comes back to that listening ecosystem, which is you need to have dissected and sat down for a minute and thought about, where's my listening channels? How am I doing lots of it? How do I link my customer and employee data? How do I make sure I'm getting quality responses? And here's how I'm doing it. So we've got the survey that does this. We've got our connection of our people from offices down to the front line so that we're close as we can be to the flow of work, right? We've got our people from behind desks and close to the front of the people. We've got a dialogue that's asking questions to take our hypothesis and whatever. And we've actually changed our onboarding. Let me throw that one in. One of the biggest listening misses that happens in most organizations is you bring all these people into the organization with all these exciting ideas, they've worked for a competitor or whatever, and nobody bothers to ask them a single thing. In fact, we try to shut them down. Yeah. We try to clone them into one of us quickly. Oh, don't be doing that. Just get on with it. Wear the uniform and do that. And that's a massive missing opportunity. But what do you see when you come in here that should be different? What do you think we're crazy at? What do you think we're really good at? Right? No, I'm not talking competitor information. What I'm saying is, I'm buying that brain, I'm buying that excitement, I'm buying that perspective. It's like free consultancy. And how many organizations capitalize on that? Nothing. They spend wasted money on silly exit interviews and nothing on meetings that help you stay, retain, and get your excitement. So my point being is, I'd look at all these things from how I listen to new employees, how I'm listening through dialogue to nowcasting to getting a real pulse, what I'm doing on the annual survey. I would list all of, and what I'm doing to get my managers close to the front line of the flow of work. I'd list all of that out, I'd show what I'm learning, and that's what I would talk to an investor about. Now that's new. All this is new thinking, right? It's giving us the capability, but I would go through that. The minute my answer to that question to an investor is, yeah, I'm in the Great Places to Work survey, is I think if I was the investor, I'd ask a few more questions.
Yeah. What I really took from that, David, is almost like, what are you listening for, right? So it's like this historical, so as you were talking visually, it was this 3-part pillar of historical data. So what's happened in the organization, right? Listening for the now, and how are you listening for the now, but also how are you listening for the future, right? And actually, when you map it out like that, you start to see different audiences and the key strengths they play into all of these pillars, because the future casting, so that, future, onboarding sits really well with that, right? Because then you're bringing people in who have new energy and they're so enthusiastic and actually understanding those gaps that is the blind spots of an organization, what we haven't thought about before, and actually how can that help us move forward. That is such key data that a lot of organizations do miss, because again, it's that culture of this is what we do, this is how we do. It's worked in the past. If it's not broken, don't fix it. And I think again, just changing that question into what am I actually listening for is a really tangible way, I think, for any HR leader practitioner. It's something that it's a quick win. It's something that you can start doing, and it's actually then you obviously bring in all of the technology from you guys here at WorkBuzz, and just understanding, okay, this can actually elevate us. In it doesn't have to be this new strategy and like new resource, and it's so overwhelming. I don't even know where to start. It's just really having a map of like a historic, now, future. What does that look like for our organisation?
It's well put, and I that future forward thing as well, because a lot of things in HR tend to be historically, if I'm critical, and I'm critical of my own profession, tend to be negative. Why people are sick from work and absent. They never looked at why they came to work, right? Everything tended to be a bit negative and pessimistic. And it's the same we have this obsession with history and what happened historically, which has a role, but a lack of obsession about future. Do you know what I mean? We love exit interviews, but we never talked to them when they were employed by us, right? So why get obsessed about a retrospective game that's played when people leave and pretend why they've left and change the reason to protect their reputation? No, let's try and look at onboarding. Let's look at new employees. So I think these are great points about looking for the positive, looking for the future, looking for ideas, not just looking for problems. And I think there's something in that.
Or I think if you are looking for problems, you sidestep then because you're looking ahead rather than when they hit you. I can imagine if you're in a board meeting and you get the question from an investor in terms of how good is your listening, and operational listening is much more practical. Imagine if you were having a conversation around to answer that, and it went along the lines of, we think it's pretty good. We were going to be launching, if it's a restaurant chain, we were launching a brand new menu item in the spring. All of our customer testing was this product, this dish, 10 out of 10. We went out to all of our restaurant managers and we got feedback saying our chefs need training to make it. We don't have pots and pans the right size to manufacture that. In our locations, in rural areas, not big enough to serve that, make it up. So therefore, we've applied Tweet ABC, and then we launched it, and it's been much more successful because of that. I think you are really trying to connect to the front line, and you're trying to flush out those issues before they happen. And for me, that's what listening has to become. We have to democratize it. In HR, engagement is beautiful in terms of that link to retention, that link to discretionary efforts. But if we can democratize listening into operations, that's really where I think we make work better for everybody. And for investors, you really start to drive the bottom line. It really connects to organization performance.
So if we're looking at the history, we're now casting, and then we're thinking about the future and what are we listening for? I loved the way you put that. And if part of what we're listening for is that really practical, on the ground, tactical improvements to the flow of work so that people can show up and show their best self within their day-to-day, what is a question that leaders should be asking to fulfill that formula we're creating here?
So I can offer some perspective from dialogues. I don't think there's one question sort of fits all, but I can share some examples we've had. For one of our clients, big retail business, they were piloting in around 80 locations. So too many for me to really go and visit and talk to every store manager. And they had a brand manager go out with a key question around how the pilot's working, anything learning you can share, anything we can do better. And before we approach the big national rollout, anything you would change. And I was sort of just going through some of that feedback, staying really close to the products to try to walk the floor in the way we've been talking to. And we had this 3-minute soundbite for a voice note, which basically said some love the concept, some operational sort of tactical issues, the way the product's been rolled out, doesn't link to certain systems that makes it hard to sort of scale and all their teams to get behind. but so much amazing, tangible feedback just through this 3-minute voice note that would never be captured through a survey with text forms or Likert scales around that. So, but a specific question linked to someone's day-to-day work that was relevant. And that's just one example. The other examples around general topics in terms of we think about making a change. How do we work on the grounds? We have made a change. It hasn't landed. How can we improve it? But the key is having a leader front up, asking that question on camera that makes them visible, making it really easy to digest that question, relevant to people on the grounds, and then have to close that feedback loop. So it's more about, rather than the question, it's about the process, and it's about changing listening. So it's not a program, it's not a project, and it becomes a habit. It becomes just the way you work and part of your culture and DNA. So that's, for me, I think the biggest learning that we've had over the last 18 months, creating dialogue.
I think with any, whenever you go through change, you have to, if you're suddenly going to change your listening, one of the things that we know affects trust is I call a stretch and jerk. Like you can't suddenly turn up, just like sometimes line managers do, right? They turn up just before and buy everybody a coffee just before the annual survey, and then expect it to look natural and say, just a coffee mod. They almost know when the survey must be coming because we've all just got coffee bought, right? Or there's a nicety or whatever. You can't jerk people like that in terms of like, it has to be consistent, to be authentic. And it's the same when you bring in new listening techniques. One has to think about, if you are going to change your listening strategy, you can't just throw it in and think everybody thinks, oh, this is the new listening world. I've never been listened to for 20 years and now I tell you all my secrets. It doesn't work like that. You've got to go through the change management. And so therefore, one needs to think about, if you are going to open up the channels and genuinely want it, you've got to think about which leaders, in which way, asking what questions, and making sure that the principles of making sure it's a question that needs to be asked from an employee perspective, not a corporate question that makes no sense to a frontline worker whatsoever, or making it a question that ticks an HR box because they're filling some sort of external survey in. Right, it's something that's relevant to the life of the person you're asking that makes sense to them. But I do think you've got to think about the change management of that. And if I was suddenly dialoguing with 120 countries and it had never been done before, my opening question might not be, tell me what you think of me, right? Because I might get a lot of answers, or I might get a lot of people saying, I don't trust this. It might be, let's start talking, like you would in a normal conversation. Let's start talking. Oh, he means business. He came back to us. Let me ask you something else. And then eventually I might land the question that I really want to ask, which is, what's it really like to work here? Tell me what I need to know. So I think you've got to think about building trust in a product, just as you're building trust in a new listening methodology, in the same way that I'm trying to build trust in myself as a leader, if you like.
That takes time.
Yeah. And that takes time and a thoughtful, intentional process. You can't just be authentic, go out and shock them into being the most open person in the world when they've not had that before. You've got to earn that respect. You've got to earn that trust. You've got to create that environment, and that means you need to think carefully about the types of questions you ask first and how you build it up. And ultimately, you can get some really deep, risky questions that you really want to know about, but you don't want to start with that. You want to start with things that help them understand and trust the process.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's one of the things I always, every organisation I work with, is one of the questions I would always ask them is your systems of building trust. And essentially what I mean by that is just what touch points do you have already of how you consistently build trust? Because, I love that example of, if you're new in the organisation, the first question is not going to be, please give me some feedback. I don't even know you, mate. So you've just started, right? And so there has to be things that you're intentionally doing over time. And that could be once every month, right? Like you meet with the people in your team or, different parts of the organization. That could be, you do have a coffee morning, but it is consistent. It's not just when the survey is going out, it's just thinking of the structure of your organization. Of course, if you're hybrid, if you're whatever it is, what are your systems of building trust? Because I think that intentionality and consistency is what's going to get you the responses that you want. And sometimes it might be those really hard questions that you ask, and you might get responses that you don't know what to do with. And it's okay for the leader to just sit with that. And I think, again, we're moving into just a society where a lot of the responses that we might get, because we're talking about, listening and, engagement, might not be what you want to hear. And I think there's a skill that has to be cultivated in leaders and managers now, that is just being to sit with that for a moment before responding. And I think a lot of us before, as leaders, part of our identity is to be quick to respond. It's like someone says something, already you have a solution and now you want to fix it. There's that coaching skill almost that is more important than ever, that even as you're building trust, you're going to be hearing things that it's not aligning with your strategy, it's not part of your vision. And how do you sit with that for a moment before you then say, okay, how can I use this? How can I bring this into the strategy? How can I bring this into another meeting with, whoever, with the CEO? And I think that already becomes like another underrated skill that is just, as we're moving into new tech space and evolving, that skill becomes more and more important, of just sitting with the discomfort.
Thank you. We're going to wrap up with a quick fire. So as
Sounds very exciting.
quick fire question, as succinct of an answer you could possibly give to this question. We came into this conversation wanting to push the boundary with employee listening, ask what's next, and we've spoken about operational listening, the different components of that. If someone's listening to this, watching this, and thinking, this all sounds quite aspirational for me or my organisation, what's one thing they could go away and implement tomorrow, hopefully, that could just push them a little bit further in terms of their employee listening approach in their organisation? What would you recommend as being the one thing that someone could do next? Steve, do you want to start with you?
I'm going to steal this from David, so hopefully I'm not going to steal all your fun that. So I think get managers from head office. If you have stores, locations, different offices around the UK and the world, get them out from behind their desk to your stores, to your restaurants, and bring back ideas. Challenge them to bring back what you've heard to work in, what we can build on, best practices we can share, and just start building that muscle slowly.
Thank you. Talua?
I would say cultivate a habit of a 2-minute check-in. So that's for yourself and for the person you're talking to. So essentially checking in with yourself, because a regulated leader is also what we need now, and just understanding, am I okay? Like, how am I feeling? And then before you get into whatever it is that you want to get into with your managers or, frontline workers, check in with them, really. What's showing up for you? And I think that 2-minute check-in can actually have that ripple effect of trust that we've been talking about, and actually everything else from psychological safety to building that culture. But just start with a 2-minute check-in. It's tangible, it's a quick win, and it builds that habit of trust.
Thank you. David?
I would say, I'm going to be cheeky, but I'd say dish the town halls. Make it a communication newsletter, and find a new way of nowcasting. Find a new way of finding out what's really going on right now across your dispersed workforce, and try it. That's what I would say.
Wonderfully succinct. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing your experience, your stories, your insight, and for future casting a bit with us today, and thinking about what does the future of employee listening feel like right now. And I'm sure if we have the same conversation in 6 months' time, there'll be even more to talk about. So perhaps we'll come back together for another conversation like this. I'll ask you similar questions, and we'll see what the technology is doing and the stories that we can come up with at that point. But thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, wrap.